In 1943, a French pilot living in exile in New York, homesick for his country and deeply troubled by a world tearing itself apart in the worst war in human history, sat down and wrote a story about a small boy who lived alone on a tiny planet, tended a single rose, and traveled the universe asking questions that adults had entirely forgotten how to ask. That story, 100 pages long and illustrated by hand, was published quietly that year. The pilot died in action the following year, shot down over the Mediterranean, and the book he left behind went on to become one of the most widely read books ever written. It has been translated into more than 300 languages and dialects. It has sold more than 200 million copies. It is simultaneously the most purchased French book in history, one of the most beloved children's books ever written, one of the most frequently studied philosophical texts in the world, and something that defies every category you try to put it in, because it is genuinely all of these things at once and none of them completely. The book is The Little Prince. The pilot was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And in this video, I want to do something I think very few breakdowns of this book have actually done. Take it seriously as the philosophical, emotional, and deeply personal document it actually is, rather than either reducing it to a simple children's fable or drowning it in so much literary analysis that the thing that makes it extraordinary, which is its directness, its tenderness, and its almost unbearable emotional honesty, gets buried under the weight of interpretation. This video is going to be longer than most book summaries you'll find, because this book deserves more than a summary. We're going to walk through the story itself, the ideas it contains, the life of the man who wrote it, why it resonates the way it does across cultures and generations, what specific passages and images have stayed in the minds of hundreds of millions of readers, and what reading it carefully, really carefully, as an adult who has learned the things adults learn, can actually teach you about the life you're currently living. Stick with me to the end, because the final section of this video contains what I think is the most important thing this book is trying to say, and it's the part that gets talked about least. Let's begin with the man who wrote it, because you cannot fully understand The Little Prince without understanding something about the extraordinary, contradictory, deeply searching life of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He was born in Lyon, France, in 1900, into a family of minor nobility. He was by all accounts a strange, dreamy, deeply affectionate child, one of those people who seem somehow to be paying attention to a layer of the world that most people can't quite see. He loved mathematics and poetry in equal measure, which is a combination that turns out to be relevant to everything he later wrote. He became a pilot in his early 20s, at a time when aviation was still a genuinely dangerous frontier, when routes were unmapped, instruments were unreliable, and flying across the Sahara or the Andes meant facing conditions that regularly killed pilots who were doing everything right. He flew mail routes across Africa and South America. He crashed in the Libyan desert and nearly died of thirst before being found by a Bedouin caravan. He crashed in the Guatemalan jungle. He crashed in the Sahara again, this time with his mechanic, and the two of them spent 4 days walking through the desert without water before being rescued with hours to spare. Each of these experiences appears, transformed but recognizable, in his writing, most directly in his 1939 book Wind, Sand and Stars, which many critics consider one of the greatest memoirs ever written about the experience of aviation in its early years. But more than the physical experiences, what his flying life gave him was a particular perspective, the view from above. From the air, national borders are invisible. Human conflicts look different. Deserts and oceans and mountains reveal their true scale. Cities become patterns of light. And the smallness of individual human concerns, relative to the vastness of the planet beneath you and the cosmos above you, becomes viscerally obvious in a way that no amount of reading or thinking can quite replicate. This perspective runs through everything Saint-Exupéry wrote, and it is nowhere more present than in The Little Prince, whose protagonist literally lives on a tiny planet and travels between stars, viewing human civilization from outside and finding it, again and again, baffling. When World War II began, Saint-Exupéry was in his late 30s, too old by conventional military standards to fly combat missions, and suffering the physical consequences of his many crashes. He lobbied repeatedly and passionately to be allowed to fly anyway. He was eventually given permission to fly reconnaissance missions over occupied France, which he did with something approaching recklessness, as if daring fate. He flew his last mission in July 1944 and was never seen again. His plane was not found until more than 50 years later, discovered off the coast of Marseille. He wrote The Little Prince in New York in 1942 while living in a borrowed apartment, separated from his wife, unable to return to his occupied homeland, anxious about the war, and by most accounts profoundly unhappy. The book is, on one level, the record of what a man chooses to think about and care about when everything external has been stripped away. And it turns out what he chose to think about was love, loneliness, the corruption of adulthood, the purity of children's questions, the nature of responsibility, and the ache of separation from things you have given your heart to. Now let's go through the story itself, because whatever else this book is, it is a story, and understanding what actually happens in it is the necessary foundation for everything else. The narrator is an adult, a pilot who crashes his plane in the Sahara Desert. Alone, 1,000 miles from any inhabited place, he is trying to repair his engine when a small boy appears beside him and asks him with great seriousness to draw him a sheep. The pilot, who in childhood had a talent for drawing but was discouraged from it by adults who told him his drawings were incomprehensible, draws a sheep. The boy rejects it. He draws another, rejected again. He draws a box and tells the boy that the sheep is inside the box, and the boy is delighted. "Yes," he says, "that is exactly the kind of sheep I wanted." This opening exchange is not a whimsical detail. It is the thesis of the entire book. The boy accepts a box as containing a sheep because he can imagine the sheep inside. The pilot, as a child, drew a boa constrictor that had swallowed an elephant, and every adult who saw it said it was a picture of a hat. They could only see what was on the surface. The boy can see what is inside. From the first page, the book is about the difference between these two modes of seeing, and it never stops being about that. Over the following days in the desert, the pilot and the little prince talk. Gradually, the prince's story emerges. He lives alone on a tiny planet, asteroid B612, with 3 volcanoes, a few baobab seeds he carefully pulls up before they can grow too large, and a rose. One day a rose grew from a seed he didn't plant. She was beautiful and proud and vain and demanding, and she told him that she was unique in all the universe, and he believed her. He tended her, put a glass dome over her when the wind came, sheltered her from the caterpillars, listened to her complaints and her boasts. But eventually something about her vanity and her demands made him unhappy, and he decided to leave his planet and travel the stars. He visited 6 other planets before arriving on Earth. Each planet was inhabited by a single adult. On the first, a king who ruled over nothing but who needed subjects and so immediately appointed the prince as a subject. On the second, a vain man who wanted only to be admired, who asked the prince to clap for him, and who clapped whenever the prince asked him to, wanting to be admired even for his willingness to accept admiration. On the third, a drunkard who drank to forget that he was ashamed of drinking. On the fourth, a businessman who spent his days counting the stars, insisting that he owned them, because he had thought of owning them before anyone else did. On the fifth, a lamplighter on a tiny planet whose planet turned so fast that he had to light the lamp and extinguish it every minute, following orders that had made sense when the planet turned slowly, and that now simply made him endlessly tired. On the sixth, a geographer who mapped mountains and rivers he had never seen, had never left his desk, and told the prince that flowers were ephemeral and therefore not worth recording. Then Earth, where the prince found first a desert, and then a serpent who told him cryptically that he could send him home, and then a garden of 5,000 roses, identical to his rose, which made him weep, because his rose had told him she was unique, and here were 5,000 just like her, and he had come all this way and left his tiny planet for her. And then a fox who taught him the concept of taming, and who gave him, in a few short sentences, the heart of the entire book. What the fox told him was this: to tame something is to establish ties with it. Before the prince came, the fox said, "You were for me just a boy like 100,000 other boys, and I had no need of you. And you had no need of me. But if you tame me, then we will need each other. You will be unique to me in all the world. And the wheat fields, which mean nothing to me now because I do not eat bread, will remind me of you because they are the color of your hair." And then the fox said the thing that has been copied, embroidered, painted, tattooed, and quoted more than almost any other sentence in 20th century literature. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. The prince understood. His rose was unique not because she was literally one of a kind in the universe. She was unique because he had tamed her and she had tamed him. The time he had spent on her, the care he had taken of her, the nights he had listened to her complaints, the mornings he had put the glass dome over her, these things were what made her his rose, different from all the other roses, irreplaceable in a way no other rose could be. He went back to the snake. He allowed himself to be bitten. And in the morning the pilot found the boy's body, small and still in the desert sand. The prince had gone home, back to his asteroid, back to his rose. That is the story. It takes about an hour to read, and yet it has occupied the minds of philosophers, psychologists, theologians, and ordinary readers for 8 decades, because almost every element of it is doing more than it appears to do on the surface. Let's go through the book's major ideas, because they deserve to be named directly rather than simply implied through the story. The first and most pervasive idea is the corruption that adulthood performs on the capacity for genuine seeing. The adults in this book, all of them, are presented not as villains but as people who have been narrowed, people who have made a wrong turn somewhere and are now trapped in a loop of concern about things that don't ultimately matter: power, admiration, ownership, information, productivity, and the avoidance of shame. The book does not condemn them. It mourns them. Saint-Exupéry writes of them with a sadness rather than a contempt, because he clearly sees in them something that he feared in himself: the gradual replacement of essential questions with practical ones, of genuine curiosity with the management of appearances. This is not a simple or sentimental argument. The book is not saying that children are innocent and wise and adults are corrupt and foolish. It is saying something more precise: that there is a particular form of attention that children have before the world teaches them to be otherwise, an attention to what is essential rather than what is merely visible, and that this attention can be maintained into adulthood, but only with deliberate effort, only by someone who is willing to look foolish to those around them, only by someone who has not entirely traded their capacity for wonder for the social currency of appearing sensible. The pilot in the story is a man who never fully completed that trade. He is an adult who still carries his drawing of the boa constrictor that swallowed an elephant. He is an adult who knows what it means that the little prince's laughter sounds like bells. He is an adult who is, in some part of himself that the world has not yet reached, still the child who wanted to draw but was told to study geography instead. The second major idea is the nature of love and attachment, explored through the rose and the fox. The rose is one of the most honestly drawn portraits of a difficult relationship in all of literature, despite being contained in fewer pages than most magazine articles. She is vain and demanding and sometimes dishonest, and she tells the prince things about her strength and her thorns that she doesn't quite believe herself. She is, in short, a rose with insecurities who manages them through pride, and who loves the prince in a way she doesn't quite know how to express directly, and who lets him leave without saying what she actually feels because her pride is easier to reach than her vulnerability. The prince, in turn, loves her without being able to fully understand her, tends her without being able to see past her demands to the tenderness underneath, and eventually leaves because he doesn't yet know the fox's lesson, that the time you have given someone is what makes them irreplaceable, and that difficulty is not evidence of a mistake, and that the thing you have tamed is yours as much as you are its. The fox's lesson is not only about love in the romantic sense. It is about all genuine attachment, to a place, to a person, to practice, to a way of life. What makes something matter to you is not its objective qualities. 5,000 roses can be indistinguishable from your rose in every objective measurement, and be worth nothing at all to you compared to the one rose you have tended, worried over, sheltered from wind and caterpillars, and spent your particular irreplaceable hours caring for. This is a radical statement about value. Most of us live in a world that insists on objective, externally verifiable measures of value. The businessman who counts the stars is counting them according to a logic that the world he inhabits considers entirely reasonable. Ownership requires counting. Counting establishes ownership. Ownership is a form of value. But the prince can see what the businessman cannot. Owning something that you do nothing for, that you do not tend or protect or enjoy, that merely sits in a ledger as a number, is a form of non-relationship that is the opposite of what actually makes anything valuable. What actually makes something valuable is what you have put into it: the hours, the attention, the worry, the joy. The little prince's rose is valuable not because of what she is, but because of what he has done for her and what she has become to him through the accumulated time of their relationship. And this is true of everything we genuinely love, whether we can articulate it or not. The third major idea is responsibility, captured in a single sentence that is easy to pass over on a first reading and impossible to forget once it has landed properly. After the fox has taught the prince about taming, the fox says, "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed." This sentence contains a complete ethics. If you enter into a genuine relationship with something or someone, if you tame and are tamed, if you establish ties that make something unique to you in all the world, then you have taken on a responsibility that does not end when the relationship becomes inconvenient, or when you feel ready for something else, or when the thing you have tamed turns out to be more complicated than you expected. You are responsible for your rose, not because she is perfect, not because she is easy, not because she never makes demands you wish she wouldn't make, but because she is yours and you are hers, and that relationship, once entered into genuinely, carries its own weight. This idea is simultaneously one of the most beautiful and one of the most demanding things the book contains. In a world that increasingly treats relationships, commitments, and attachments as provisional and upgradable, as things to maintain only as long as they serve your immediate needs, and to replace when something seemingly better becomes available, the fox's instruction is almost countercultural. You are responsible forever for what you have tamed. Not until you get bored. Not until someone better comes along. Not until the relationship requires more than you feel like giving. Forever. The fourth major idea is loneliness, which runs through the entire book like a river under the narrative surface. Saint-Exupéry was a profoundly lonely man in ways that had nothing to do with being alone. He was married to a woman he loved but couldn't live with simply. He had friendships of great warmth and long duration. He was celebrated and admired. And yet, by almost all accounts, including his own, he moved through the world with a sense of not quite belonging that never fully left him. The little prince is lonely on his asteroid, not unhappily lonely necessarily, but essentially alone in the way that people who see the world unusually are always alone. There is no one around who sees what they see, or asks the questions they ask, or understands why the things that matter to them matter. His loneliness is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived, and the book treats it with an honesty that most books about loneliness do not quite have, because most books about loneliness suggest, at some level, that it is temporary, that connection is the answer, that the right person or the right community will dissolve it. Saint-Exupéry knew, in whatever way a person knows the things they cannot say directly, that some forms of loneliness are constitutive, that they are part of who you are and how you see, and that the deepest form of connection, as the fox shows, does not dissolve this loneliness so much as make it bearable by giving you something to be responsible for. The fifth major idea, and perhaps the one that requires the most careful reading to see clearly, is the relationship between beauty and impermanence. The geographer told the little prince that flowers are ephemeral, that they last only a day or two, and that therefore a geographer does not record them. The prince was troubled by this. His rose was ephemeral, and yet the geographer's dismissal struck him as profoundly wrong. The book's response to this is implicit rather than stated, but it's one of the most important things the book contains. The geographer's error is not factual but philosophical. He has assumed that impermanence reduces value, that things which do not last are less worth attending to than things which do. But the book suggests, through the rose and through the fox's lesson, that impermanence is not the enemy of value but perhaps its precondition. The rose matters so much precisely because she is fragile, because she needs protection, because she cannot take care of herself entirely. Her need and her fragility are not defects in her value, but the very things that call the prince into relationship with her, that give him something to do for her, that make the accumulated hours of care meaningful in retrospect. This is a quietly radical position on mortality and beauty. We live in a culture that tends to treat impermanence as a problem to be solved, aging as a disease to be cured, and the fact of death as a kind of failure of the universe to have arranged things properly. Saint-Exupéry, writing in a time and from a life that had brought him into direct contact with death on multiple occasions, arrived at something different, not an acceptance of impermanence that is really just resignation, but a genuine appreciation of it as constitutive of value rather than destructive of it. Now let's talk about the book's most famous lines, not because famous lines are the point, but because they have become famous for reasons that are worth understanding. The line about seeing rightly with the heart is the most widely quoted, and it is also the one most susceptible to being misread as a defense of irrationality or sentimentality. It is neither. What the fox is saying is not that emotions trump evidence, or that feeling something strongly makes it true. He is saying something more precise and more interesting, that there is a category of reality that is not accessible through the kind of looking that catalogs and measures and counts, and that this category, which includes love and loyalty and meaning and beauty, and the value of particular things rather than kinds of things, requires a different instrument of perception. The heart, in this usage, is not opposed to the mind. It is the part of the mind that understands relationships rather than just objects, particulars rather than just categories, the unique and irreplaceable rather than the interchangeable. The line about being responsible forever for what you have tamed is the second most quoted, and it has a directness that is, on reflection, almost shocking for a book that is supposed to be for children. It is not a comforting statement. It is a demanding one. It places the weight of genuine attachment squarely on the person who has entered into it, and it declines to offer any relief from that weight. You tame this thing. You are responsible for it. Not until circumstances change. Not until someone else comes along. Forever. The third great line is less often quoted but perhaps the deepest. What makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere it hides a well. This comes near the end of the book, and it operates at multiple levels simultaneously. Literally, the pilot and the prince are walking through the Sahara looking for water, and the prince says this to explain why he finds the desert beautiful. Figuratively, it is a statement about the nature of hidden value. The desert is not beautiful despite being empty, but because beneath its emptiness is the possibility of water, life, something essential. And metaphorically, it applies to the entire book's vision of the world. What makes ordinary life bearable, and sometimes even beautiful, is the presence of something hidden within it that you might not find, that you must look for, that is not guaranteed, but that is there. The fourth line deserves special attention because it is less famous but more practically useful than any of the others. Grown-ups never understand anything by themselves, and it is tiresome for children to be always and forever explaining things to them. This is not really a line about adults and children. It is a line about modes of understanding, about whether you approach the world with the assumption that your existing categories are adequate to it, or with genuine openness to the possibility that something you're encountering might not fit into anything you already know how to see. The little prince, like all people who see unusually, is exhausted not by the world's difficulty, but by the labor of translating his perception into forms that people with narrower categories can accept. Let's talk now about why this book resonates across such wildly different cultures, languages, and generations. Because the fact of its global reach is not accidental and deserves examination. The answer is probably that the experience of losing your capacity for essential seeing, your capacity to look at a boa constrictor digesting an elephant and see it as a boa constrictor digesting an elephant rather than a hat, is genuinely universal. Every adult has experienced something like the conversion the pilot describes, a time when you understood something in a way you can no longer quite access, when you could see something that you now have to work to see again. The specific form this takes varies enormously by culture and circumstance. But the experience of having once been able to see more clearly, of having lost something in the process of becoming a functional adult, is one that seems to be genuinely human rather than particular to any one tradition. The book also resonates because it is honest about love in a way that most books about love are not. It does not pretend that love is easy, or that the beloved is simple, or that dedication to someone or something is without cost. The rose is difficult. The responsibility is forever. The prince wept when he saw 5,000 roses in the garden. These are not the experiences of an idealized, uncomplicated love. They are the experiences of real attachment, which is always also exposure, always also the possibility of loss, always also the discovery that the thing you love has aspects you didn't expect, and that will require more of you than you planned. And the book resonates, perhaps most fundamentally, because it is unafraid to take seriously the things that most adult discourse treats as frivolous. The beauty of a sunset, the color of a fox, the sound of a child's laughter, the importance of a single rose among millions. In a world that rewards seriousness about productivity, optimization, and acquisition, and that treats wonder as something to be grown out of, this book insists, very quietly and very firmly, that the things dismissed as not serious are in fact the most serious things of all. Let's now spend some time on what reading this book as an adult, with full adult comprehension of what it's saying, actually demands of you. Because I think this is the conversation that almost nobody has about The Little Prince, and it is the most important one. The book is not simply a nostalgia trip to childhood innocence. It is a diagnosis and an invitation. The diagnosis is this: you have probably lost something. In the process of becoming someone who can navigate the adult world competently, who can hold a job and manage money and maintain relationships, and understand that flowers are ephemeral and therefore not worth cataloging, you have probably let something atrophy that was once natural to you. The capacity to see the sheep inside the box. The capacity to be troubled by a geographer who maps things without ever seeing them. The capacity to understand, without explanation, why 5,000 identical roses cannot replace the one rose you have tended. The invitation is this: you can find it again. Not in its original form, which is the form of a child who hasn't yet been taught better, but in a more durable, harder-won form. The form of an adult who has been through all the narrowing that adulthood performs and has emerged on the other side, still capable of asking what a boa constrictor digesting an elephant actually looks like, and who is willing to look slightly foolish to people who can only see the hat. This is not easy. The world rewards the hat seers. The world gives jobs, promotions, social status, and the appearance of seriousness to the people who have fully committed to seeing surfaces. It offers very little external reward to the people who insist on looking for what is inside the box, who waste time being moved by the color of wheat fields, who find themselves unable to fully endorse the businessman's logic even when they know it is perfectly coherent. But Saint-Exupéry's entire life and work is an argument that the cost of the hat seer's path, though it is the socially rewarded path, is higher than it appears. The cost is living at a constant slight remove from what is actually happening around you, at a constant slight remove from genuine relationship with the things and people in your life, at a constant slight remove from whatever made being alive feel like it was worth the effort before efficiency became the primary criterion. The Little Prince is not asking you to be a child. He is asking you to remember what you could see when you were one, and to decide whether you are willing to try to see it again. Now let me address something that is often said about this book that I think is worth examining carefully, because it is not quite right, and the precise place where it is not quite right matters. People often say that The Little Prince is a book about keeping your inner child alive. This is close but slightly off. The inner child framing implies that what you're trying to preserve is a kind of emotional expressiveness or playfulness or freedom from social convention, which is a real and valuable thing, but is not quite what the book is about. What the book is about is more specific. It is about a particular quality of attention, the attention that goes past the surface of things to their inner reality, the attention that asks what the boa constrictor actually contains rather than accepting the conventional response that it is a hat. This quality of attention is not the same as emotional expressiveness or freedom from convention, and it is not exclusive to children. Adults can have it and often do. But it requires cultivation, and it requires willingness to look at the world as if your existing categories might not be adequate to it, which is genuinely uncomfortable for people who have invested heavily in the competence of those categories. Saint-Exupéry had this quality of attention in unusual abundance, and it is what makes his writing, in this book and elsewhere, feel different from most writing. He wasn't trying to look like he had unusual insight. He simply paid a different kind of attention than most people pay and wrote down what that attention found. Before we move to the close, let me talk about something the book contains that almost no summary or analysis mentions, because it is not a philosophical statement or a memorable aphorism, but rather a structural feature of the narrative that carries its own kind of meaning. Throughout the book, the pilot keeps asking the prince to describe his planet, his rows, his travels. And the prince sometimes answers directly and sometimes doesn't, sometimes changing the subject, sometimes looking away, sometimes becoming sad in a way the pilot can see but not quite reach. And the pilot keeps saying, in one form or another, that he is unable to draw the prince well enough, that all his illustrations are imperfect approximations, that the prince he is trying to show you is not quite the prince he knew. This narrative modesty, this insistence on the inadequacy of the representation, is unusual and important. The book is not pretending to have fully captured what it set out to capture. It is acknowledging from within itself that the most important things resist complete capture, that they can be pointed toward but not contained, that the drawing is always less than the thing it depicts. And this acknowledgement is itself an expression of the book's central insight. What is essential is invisible, and the most honest thing you can do when trying to convey something essential is to show the outline of where it was rather than claiming to have preserved the thing itself. Let's do a full account of the book's major themes before we move to the close. First, the corruption that adulthood performs on genuine seeing, and the cost of trading essential perception for social competence. Second, the nature of value as constituted through attention and relationship rather than through objective qualities or ownership. Third, the fox's ethics of responsibility, the idea that tamming something, entering genuine relationship with it, creates an obligation that doesn't end when circumstances change. Fourth, the particular loneliness of unusual perception, and the way that genuine connection, though it cannot dissolve this loneliness, can make it bearable. Fifth, the counterintuitive claim that impermanence is a feature of value rather than a defect, that what is fragile and ephemeral deserves our most careful attention precisely because of its fragility. And sixth, the invitation to remember what you could see before the world taught you to see differently, and to decide whether you are willing to try to see it again. This is a short book. You can read it in an hour, perhaps two if you stop to think, which you should. But its ideas are not short. They are the ideas of a man who had lived an unusually large life and who used the language of a children's story because, as he clearly understood, the deepest things are most clearly seen by people who have not yet learned to look past them. Before you go, I want to suggest something specific, which is different from the kind of closing suggestion I usually make in videos about practical personal development books. I'm not going to ask you to do a push-up or set a minimum standard or write down your goals. I'm going to ask you to do something simpler and stranger. Tonight or sometime in the next few days, find the last time you looked at something, really looked at it, with the full, unhurried attention that makes a thing present to you rather than just registered. A face, a tree, a room in your house, a piece of music, the view from a window you look through every day without seeing. Give it 10 minutes of genuine attention, the kind of attention the little prince gives to his sunsets on his tiny planet, watching them again and again, moving his chair slightly to follow the light. You don't need to conclude anything from this. You don't need to write it down or share it or turn it into a goal. You just need to look in the way the book is asking you to look and notice what was there that you hadn't been seeing. That's the practice this book is recommending, not a technique or a system or a framework. Just the willingness to look at the world as if it might contain things that your current categories haven't yet made room for, and to give those things a moment of real attention, which is the only way they can ever be seen. Close your eyes for a moment and remember something from your childhood that you found beautiful, not because you were told it was beautiful, but because you simply looked at it and felt it to be so. A color, a sound, a particular quality of light at a particular time of day. Hold that memory for a moment and notice what it feels like in your body to have genuinely looked at something. That feeling is what the book is about. That capacity is what the book is asking you to find again. And it is, as the pilot would say, something that cannot be fully drawn, that every illustration only approximates, but that you recognize immediately when you remember it, because it is not something that adulthood can fully take away. It can only make it harder to find. It is still there, under all the efficiency and the seriousness and the knowing how things work, under the businessman's ledger and the geographer's maps and the king's need for subjects, under the hat that is only a hat. The boa constrictor is still in there, and the sheep is still inside the box. Thanks for watching all the way through. That which is essential is waiting to be seen, whenever you're willing to look. Let me go deeper into the 6 planets the little prince visited, because each one is worth examining individually rather than simply listing, and together they form one of the most economical and piercing portraits of human self-deception ever assembled. The first planet, the King's Planet, introduces the theme of authority without genuine connection. The king has no subjects. He rules over nothing. But when the prince arrives, the king immediately appoints him a subject, because a king without subjects is a contradiction in terms that the king cannot tolerate. The book's description of the king is comic but not unkind. He was a good king in his way, who gave only reasonable orders, but everything he ordered was a description of what was already happening anyway. He ordered the prince not to yawn, then immediately gave him permission to yawn when he saw the prince was tired, because the king's system required that every outcome appear to be the result of his command. Power, the book suggests, that has no genuine relationship to anything real, that exists only to be seen to exist, is a form of loneliness masquerading as authority. The second planet, the vain man's planet, shows the logical conclusion of needing to be admired rather than seen. The vain man wants the prince to admire him. He waves his hat when the prince claps. He asks the prince to clap and then waves his hat. He wants to be the most admired man on the planet, but he is alone on his planet, which means he can be both the most admired and the only person available to admire him. He cannot perceive the circularity of his arrangement, because perceiving it would require the kind of genuine self-reflection that vanity specifically prevents. The prince, who is genuinely curious about people but honest about what he sees, finds him tiring and moves on quickly. The third planet, the drunkard's planet, is the shortest chapter in the book and perhaps the saddest. The drunkard drinks to forget that he is ashamed of drinking. When the prince asks why he is ashamed, he says he is ashamed because he drinks. And when the prince asks why he drinks, he says he drinks to forget that he is ashamed. The prince stands before this perfectly closed circle of self-destruction and simply says, more clearly than the drunkard himself has been able to, "That is rather sad." And he moves on, unable to offer anything that would help and unwilling to pretend the situation is otherwise. The fourth planet, the businessman's, receives more space than the others because the businessman represents something specifically modern, the substitution of enumeration for engagement. He counts the stars. He counts them very carefully, and he knows exactly how many there are, and he writes the number down, and he believes this constitutes ownership, which he believes constitutes a relationship with the stars. The prince tries to understand what it means to own something you don't tend, don't enjoy, and don't do anything for, and he cannot. For him, ownership without relationship is a category error. You can own a sheep and tend it, own a volcano and clean it, but owning 1,000,000 stars and doing nothing for them is not ownership in any sense that makes the owner richer in any real way. The businessman, the book suggests, has confused counting things with mattering to things, and has spent his life in a kind of relationship with the world that is formally very busy and essentially empty. The fifth planet, the Lamplighters, is the most sympathetic of the six. The lamplighter lights the lamp and extinguishes it every minute, following orders that used to make sense on a planet that turned slowly, and that now only make him exhausted on a planet that turns very fast. He is trapped not by vanity or shame or the need for power, but by something more common and more difficult to escape, an obligation he accepted in good faith that circumstances have since made absurd, which he continues to meet because he was told to and because he doesn't know what else to do. The prince thinks the lamplighter might be a friend, because he is the only one of the six who is doing something for someone other than himself, even if the something has long since stopped serving any real purpose. There is something in the lamplighter's loyal, exhausted, purposeless faithfulness that the book regards as more human than the other's self-referential arrangements. The sixth planet, the geographers, closes the circuit that the first planet opened. The king had power over nothing real. The geographer has knowledge of nothing real. He has mapped places he has never been, recorded mountains from the reports of explorers, and cannot tell the prince anything about his rose because flowers are ephemeral and therefore not worth recording. The geographer represents a particular kind of expertise that is formally comprehensive and experientially empty, the authority that comes from systematization rather than from genuine encounter. He sends the prince to Earth on the basis that Earth has a good reputation, and the prince leaves, and the geographer goes back to his maps. Together, these six figures form a diagnosis of the specific ways that intelligent, well-functioning adults can organize their lives around concerns that have drifted far from anything essential. How power and vanity and shame and ownership and obligation and systematic knowledge can each become, in their different ways, substitutes for genuine relationship with the world and the people and things in it. Let's also talk about what the book doesn't say directly but implies throughout, which is perhaps its most personal and most painful content. Saint-Exupéry's marriage to Consuelo was, by nearly all accounts, one of the most important relationships of his life and one of the most difficult. She was unconventional, temperamental, demanding, and deeply attached to him in ways that sometimes felt suffocating and sometimes felt like the most real thing in his life. He both loved her and found it impossible to live consistently in her presence. He left. He came back. He left again. He spent years far from her, and spent years thinking about her. There is no credible reading of the Rose that doesn't include Consuelo, the Rose who is vain and demanding and who has thorns she doesn't quite believe in, the Rose who tells the prince that she is unique and who means it even though she can't quite express it honestly, the Rose who watches the prince leave and who says, "Finally, I was silly. Forgive me. Try to be happy," and then falls silent because she doesn't want him to see her cry. This is not the portrayal of an idealized love. It is the portrayal of a real love, difficult, unresolved, full of misunderstanding on both sides, and ultimately, in the economy of the book, absolutely irreplaceable. The prince learns, too late in some sense and on time in another, that his Rose, with all her demands and all her vanity and all her thorns she doesn't quite believe in, is the only Rose in the universe that is truly his, because she is the one he spent his particular irreplaceable time caring for. That the man writing this was thousands of miles from his wife, in exile, in uncertainty about whether he would ever see her again, gives the Rose's story a biographical weight that makes it even more moving when you know it. He was not writing about a hypothetical Rose. He was writing about the actual, imperfect, irreplaceable person he had tamed and who had tamed him, and to whom he was, by the fox's standard, responsible forever, even when the relationship was difficult, even when he was far away, even when the difficulties had seemed to outweigh the rewards. There is one more dimension of the book that deserves careful attention: its relationship with death and with leaving. The book ends with the prince allowing himself to be bitten by the snake, which he has arranged as the mechanism for returning to his asteroid and his rose. The pilot knows what this means and does not try to stop it, and yet finds the result: the boy's empty body lying in the sand, almost unbearable. He tells us that the stars, since that night, are different for him, because he knows that somewhere among them is a small boy who laughs, and the laugh is like bells, and when the wind moves the stars he will hear that laugh. This ending is not evasive about what has happened. The boy has died, in the only way the story's logic allows him to return to what he loves, and the pilot is left alone in the desert with the memory of a small, serious face, and the knowledge that he has met someone truly real in a world full of people who have stopped being real, and that this meeting is over. But the ending is not without consolation, and the consolation is not false. The pilot says that he has been comforted by this. If a small golden bar, the color of wheat, appears in someone's field of vision and they find themselves smiling, it will be because of the little prince. Because the little prince has, in the language of the fox, tamed the pilot. And so the wheat fields that might otherwise mean nothing now remind the pilot of something essential, and the sound of the stars, on the right kind of night, sounds like bells. This is the book's answer to loss, and it is one of the most honest answers I have encountered anywhere. You are not unaffected by what you lose. The loss remains. But what you gain through the relationship, what you learn to see through it, what the world now shows you that it wouldn't have shown you without it, those things remain too. The taming is not undone by the parting. The responsibility is not lifted by the ending. And the wheat-colored star, wherever it is, still reminds you of something, still produces something in you, still makes you, on certain nights, for reasons you might not be able to explain to someone who only saw a hat, feel something like the beginning of a smile. That, I think, is what the book is ultimately about. Not innocence, not nostalgia, not the superiority of children over adults. It is about the specific, irreplaceable, forever consequential act of genuinely attending to something, genuinely entering into relationship with it, genuinely taking responsibility for it. And it is about the way that act, however brief, however difficult, however complicated by vanity and misunderstanding and distance, changes forever the person who undertook it, and changes the world they move through, and makes the wheat fields mean something, and makes the sound of bells available on nights when otherwise there would have been only silence. Saint-Exupéry was 44 years old when he disappeared. He had been flying for years with physical pain from his accumulated injuries, flying missions he probably should not have been cleared to fly, flying as if the sky was where he most genuinely belonged, as if the view from above was the only view from which the things that mattered most were properly visible. He left behind this book, written by hand, illustrated by hand in exile, by a man who did not know whether he would see his home or his wife again, and who used the form of a children's story, because the children's form was the only one honest enough to say the things he needed to say without the protective irony and the knowing distance that adult literary forms tend to require. Read it slowly. Read it with the part of yourself that still knows what a boa constrictor digesting an elephant looks like. Read it with the part of yourself that still understands, at some level below the level of words, why a rose who tells you she is unique might be telling you something true even when she is also, in some ways, not quite right. And then go tend something, the thing you have tamed, the thing you are responsible for forever, the thing that, if you look at the right fields on the right kind of evening, might still make something in you move like the sound of bells. Thanks for watching all the way through. He is not so heavy to carry, the little prince.